It's going to be an exciting talk about design systems. But first of all, important thing, code of conduct is in effect. You can read the whole thing at fda.ca/coc. Basically what this is, we're all going to be nice to each other, we're going to have a good time, and everybody will leave from here happy and having a wonderful time at the FDO. Before we get to that, a couple of announcements from our sponsors. First of all, thank you to Narwhal for sponsoring this event. It's over there. Jason, tell us a bit about Narwhal.
All right, thank you for coming tonight. There's a lot of you, for sure. So I'm happy to learn about design systems. A lot of companies use them. Narwhal's a company that helps companies build like Google, which means mostly manage your code in a mono-repo, which will let you do many cool things. If you want to learn more, talk to me later. But we are hiring, so if you're a skilled engineer, come talk to me. And I have Narwhal pens, so if you want a pen, come talk to me. Have a good night.
Thank you. And we have Hassan here from Achievers to tell us about this wonderful space we're in tonight.
Hey guys, I'm Hass. I'm a developer here and I'm a member of the tech team. We are happy to have you here. Achievers provides an employee engagement platform. It helps improve retention rates for a company. It promotes productivity, innovation, and just keeping your employees really happy and engaged with one another. We are recruiting, so come and talk to me or anyone from the Achievers team afterwards, and have a great night.
Thank you, Hassan. We also got this sweet discount for the next FITC on design ethics. It came across an email recently and it seemed very timely with the stock. Total coincidence. The code is FTO. You sign up for FITC.ca, you'll see the design ethics event, and it's on October 21st in Toronto. And that's all I have in terms of announcements. We're going to get technology switched over and we'll be with you in a second.
Hey everyone, thank you for coming out on this Monday evening to listen to us talk about building and maintaining design systems. My name is Varun. I'm the Director of UI Architecture at Wrangle.
And I'm Catharine. I'm a Senior Experience Designer also at Wrangle.
Interesting. Okay, there we go. So we're going to talk about about design systems, but we're going to start by talking a little bit about why would you want a design system. So the progression to how we came about to adopting a design system and why most people in the industry seem to be adopting a design system these days. And then we'll go into what exactly is a design system, how to build one, and lastly, some things you should consider as you're going to be maintaining it over time.
Perfect. Oh, thank you. So before we really get into what a design system is, really wanted to take a step back and talk about a problem that probably many of you guys in the room have encountered. And it's one that I know Varun and I have encountered a lot in our career, and it's the handoff problem. It looks something like this. Like this. So typically when a project starts, there's a product request or a feature request. And then at that point, designers kind of go away, they do a big discovery process, and hopefully at the end of it, they have some designs. Typically that process, the page designs are flows or a set of page designs, and really at that point, that's when a bunch of other people come around and, I think we just have to do it this way. That's when it kind of starts getting broken down. And what you get out of that is a whole bunch of different handoff documents. So you'll have a bunch of different individuals doing interaction notes, red lines, requirements documents, copy decks, whatever it is, and then all of a sudden this experience is kind of scattered across all of these different documents. And hopefully, if we've all done a good job with this process, they generally tell a story when put together, and they should be the whole thing. And then that's really where the designer's role ends. Typically, they're responsible for the end-to-end kind of holistic experience, but they often, traditionally at least when we get into the nitty-gritty, So a developer would then come in, start reading all these documents, and try to interpret, with whatever context they have, what a bunch of tasks should be. So breaking down the problem into a bunch of small implementable tasks. From there, they start implementing, and then, of course, within a week, maybe a month if you're lucky, things change. There's new requirements, there's new information that's found, and all of a sudden there has to be revisions. And that's when the chaos starts happening. So then designers are pulled back in, and they have to go all the way back to the beginning, and we're updating all the pages, have to go through all these documents, figure out what's changed, and inevitably something becomes out of date. And next thing you know, developers are scratching their head looking for what the source of truth is, and designers are frustrated because whatever they designed at the beginning doesn't necessarily look like what it is now. And next thing you know, one page looks completely different than the next, both in design and development. And the result ends up looking something like this. Maybe it's functional, hopefully it's functional, but it also is probably a little bit Frankenstein. So these are a few of the problems that we typically are kind of like what I was talking about. And they're ones that are very common. I don't think we really need to dig into them right now. But at the highest level, really what happens is there's a bunch of inefficiencies and there's a lack of consistency with the experience. As time goes on, there's a bunch of design debt, there's a bunch of technical debt, and a year down the road, maybe two, nobody really wants to touch the product anymore, and it just kind of snowballs on top of itself. Which, that really leads us to believe that there must be a better way. So, that's where we kind of are now.
So, I just want sort of the next evolution of this stuff was to switch to a more of a component-based design and development model. So we'll talk about sort of how that came about. And there were two sort of major shifts that happened in the industry that led to that. The first one was that design tools evolved to switch to more of a symbol-based model, where symbols are essentially elements that can be reused across different artboards, different projects, even different project files, that allows designers to work much more efficiently. They don't have to recreate the same assets over and over again, and it also allows them to prototype more complex states and scenarios which were otherwise previously lost. A lot of the times previously we would have to document stuff in things like tools like Confluence or Jira, which would describe step by step exactly what was happening. With the more symbol-based model, you could quickly switch between sort of the error state of an input or the success state of an input and visualize what the design would look like. And these symbols were also really crucial to be able to work in a much more scalable manner. The other sort of major trend that happened around that same time, and this is around 5 to 10 years ago, is a lot of design teams started adopting something called style guides. These style guides were standards for designing a product. So they would capture things like typography, color palettes, spacing scale, grid, all kinds of foundational visual design elements, which would guide designers on the product team to understand how to build these products. And often these were published as a static document as opposed to something living and breathing. On the development side, the other sort of major trend or major change that happened was most of the JavaScript framework switched to a component-based architecture. So previously you would build things out as entire pages. Quite often there would be a route that would render a page and then teams would work on that page starting from top to bottom. With component-based architecture, you instead sort of looked at the design that you were trying to build and decompose that UI into individual functional or logical components, build those out as components, and then combine them together, compose them together into a page, and that's where you would introduce sort of the functional or the logical layer. So if you look at some of these two models, there's symbols on the design side, and there were components on the development side. And with the components also, another really popular trend was to start building out component libraries. So a team would build out reusable components that could be used not just within the team, but maybe if your organization is large enough and you have multiple teams, across those two teams. So this was kind of a, this was pretty exciting time. For the first time, both designers and developers were working on the same mental model. We were thinking about, we were designing and developing UIs by breaking things down into sort of more isolated UI components, and then composing those into larger groups that could be rendered as a page or something that the user would interact with. And this was a major change for the way we were working. Suddenly, designers and developers were talking to each other a lot more. We work in consulting, so we get to see how many different companies work, and quite often what we would find was there was a design team and a development team, and often they didn't talk to each other directly, and they would go through sort of Jira would be the communication channel between each other, or product managers. But by having this more shared component-based model, suddenly designers and developers were talking to each other. There was a lot more collaboration that was happening across these two teams. And as you were iterating the projects, the UI that you were creating, it could be much more targeted. You didn't have to think about how are we going to redesign this entire page. You could go and look at a subset of functionality on that page and go through the whole design and development process and deliver a new iteration without necessarily impacting everything around it. So, that's why you might be asking, okay, so component-based models need to solve everything. Why do we need a design system? So the component-based model was a really big step. That was sort of the foundation to what became, or what we consider to be design systems these days. Brad Frost released Atomic Design Principles. That was a foundational idea of how to think about working with components as far as design and development was concerned for web development. And this component-based model definitely reduced a lot of confusion, but it was not necessarily a single source of truth. Designers were still maintaining style guides and symbols in Sketch. Developers were maintaining their own component libraries, and there were suddenly multiple sources of truth. Initially, there was more communication between the two teams, but as teams continued to work, suddenly there would be divergence, and the design and development cycles would be out of sync, and things wouldn't necessarily be exactly the same. So in order to avoid that problem of multiple sources of truth, that's where design systems come in. We need to think about how do we work together as a team and create a single source of truth, and think about how we're going to be maintaining it and evolving it over time. So, in our opinion, design system is a systematic and scalable approach to product development, and this would include things like guidelines, principles, tooling, and code. So every single piece that you need in order to develop a product. It's a fantastic tool for scaling your design practice. A lot of companies and organizations use it to be able to offer more design to more teams with a smaller set of people, a smaller set of designers. In other cases, it might be to manage large products or multiple products that have to follow sort of the same visual language that your brand might have. So, there are a lot of different definitions of design systems, and at Rainbow, just so that we can all have sort of a shared language and we understand when we're talking about a design system, we've broken it down into 6 elements. So there's the design language, the design kit, a component library, developer sandbox, documentation, and governance. So these are sort of all the different parts of a design system that we feel needs to be there. And you might not necessarily need all of them. In a lot of cases, there might be one element that sort of manages to capture the intention of multiple pieces together. So we'll go into that next, and Catharine's going to talk about sort of what these elements are and some of the considerations that you need to make.
So yeah, how do we actually build these 6 parts? Unfortunately, there isn't one answer. There's no silver bullet here that's going to actually let you know exactly how to build these 6 parts. Because, I mean, like many things, the answer is it depends. It really, to build a design system that makes sense, It has to be what makes sense for your company. So before your organization or whatever the design system's for, it has to make sense in that context. So before you actually go ahead and build those 6 parts, make sure you take some time and take a step back and actually understand the context in which your design system is going to be used. And really, how you do that, do your product audits, have your stakeholder interviews, talk to the people who are going to be using the product, and start to ask the hard questions and get a good understanding of exactly how your design system should be used. I mean, these here are just a few examples of some of the types of questions you should ask. But like company goals, are you actually looking for absolute consistency across multiple products? Or is it really that you're looking for scalable processes that you can put across different regions or different kind of divisions of your company? Both of those do kind of employ a design system, but really how you would go about executing that would be different. Similarly, what's your organization structure? Are your team members co-located? Whether your developers and designers are sitting in the same room versus being across multiple time zones, that again, how you document everything will be very different accordingly. Thinking about scale, thinking about product complexity. Are you thinking about one team, one product, or multiple regions, multiple languages, different brands? All these things, again, will really affect the answers. So before you really dig into things, make sure you have a good foundation of the types of problems that you're going to solve and figure out what you want to break off first. So once you kind of figure that out, then you can kind of start tackling each of these things. And I guess we can dig into each one and we can talk a little bit about some of the learnings that we've had along the way. The first one being the design language. So like Varun was talking about, traditionally, kind of in the past, designers have had the idea of style guide. And the style guide's been around for a really long time, and it's something that designers really depend on. And the way that we see a design language is really thinking about it in a similar way, where it's a style guide, but a much more systematic, kind of rigorous one, where there's much more of a parallel between how it's coded as well. So really what that would look like is we might take a new design or an existing design and we'll ruthlessly systemize it, looking at colors and spacing and typography, border thickness, all of these things that can be kind of systemized into design tokens, figuring out kind of what that system should be. Everything figuring out what's the underlying scale behind your typography and your spacing, or figuring out kind of what semantic meaning should be for colors, so making sure colors are used systematically and figuring out exactly what we should name each color in a systematic and purposeful way. So going through these exercises and figuring out what has to be the same and what has to be different and rationalizing all of these things really starts creating a foundation of a design language that then can be transferred into variables in code.
So that's where we get into something called design tokens. So quite often the design language, the style guide that's maintained, is traditionally maintained by some marketing. And it comes from a print background. So it's about what should your brand look like in print, or on some more of the marketing focused visibility that your brand gets. It's not really applied to the actual product itself. So as you go through that defining the design language phase, you start thinking about what happens when you start creating a button without brand guidelines. Quite often, brand colors end up creating really inaccessible buttons because the colors are not really built to be very high contrast. So you start servicing a lot of problems which you haven't really considered before. And so the other major step is you want to codify that design language, something that the developers can consume in code, and that's what we call design tokens. It is that design language maintained in code either as CSS variables, could be a theme.js file if you use CSS and JS, really depends on whatever technology stack that you might be using. That is sort of the source of truth that is shared between design and developers, and that is how the two teams sort of communicate. So if you want to make a meaningful change where you want to iterate and change one of the brand colors, you don't have to think about specific hex values or pixel values that you might be using in code. You're only going to be referencing these design tokens. Or as a developer, you're probably using variables all over the place anyway. This might seem like, obviously we do this, but the important thing is to connect it to the design side of things so that you have the same terminology. When I say something like text primary color, it should mean the same thing to designers and developers.
Yeah, training designers to stop talking with this and starting to talk with this. I think that's the powerful thing that really starts building that connection.
So once you have those design tokens, those feed into the actual component library. Out of all of the things that we're going to be talking about today, this is probably sort of the most mature and stable piece of the entire system. Component-based JavaScript frameworks have been around for quite some time now. They seem to be the most popular way to build websites these days. So the component library generally tends to be a set of JavaScript components built with frameworks such as React, Vue, Angular, or any other new thing that came out in the last 5 minutes. And ideally, these are distributed through tools like NPM so that you can version control it and sort of track the changes that will be made over time. To be honest, there's not much more to say about the component library piece. How you go about building that, that sort of depends on, again, the specific framework that you might be using. But the only sort of core thing to remember is that the design system isn't necessarily stateful. You don't include business logic in there. You don't define that this component can only be used within a certain context. They should be built to be highly reusable. So generally, we're going to create components that are stateless and agnostic to where they can be used. Sometimes there's a relationship between components, but ideally we want to avoid adding any kind of business logic within the design system itself, and that will be handled on the application side.
And as you're trying to sort out exactly how your components should be structured and exactly what they should be, that's where, again, collaboration is really such a huge thing. Making sure that developers and designers have a shared language, because when designers are designing, they need to understand kind of what the constraints are of the components, and likewise, developers need to be on the same page. So typically what that has looked like for us is when you're actually going through designs, maybe a designer will take a first stab at breaking down the components, and then we get into a room. There's not really any solve other than that, where you have developers and designers in a room and start whiteboarding out what that React props or what the API of the component should be. And what that ends up doing is causing a shared contract between designers and developers, where designers make sure the components that are being built has the flexibility that's needed for all the use cases, and developers are sure that what's being created is technically sound with the constraints that Varun's talking about.
And once you have these components defined, it's actually kind of magical. When you're starting to define what a feature is, you don't have to talk about, we need a button, what kind of button, maybe a red button, maybe a green button, but instead you can point to something from the design system itself, and there's a name for it, and you can start describing the page in terms of your design system components, and that's extremely useful, not just for designers and developers, but also for product managers, because it makes it much easier to describe what exactly that we're building.
The next portion of the design system is the design kit. So we've spent time defining what all the components are and exactly how they should be built, and they live in JavaScript. But we also are looking for ways to make it more efficient for designers. So this typically is a Figma file or a sketch file, whatever your ecosystem is. And what it provides is a cheat sheet for anybody consuming the design system to be able to build pages and build those holistic experiences way faster than they would have been able to before. And the trick here is making sure that you structure your files in such a way that they do truly reflect how they've been created in code. So that way, and finding a way to communicate that, that's actually probably the most difficult part. And making sure that designers really understand the constraints and the tools that they've been given, and that it's being created in such a way that there are efficiencies and they can build the pages faster. I could probably talk a very long time about these tools and all the cool things Figma is doing to be able to really enable this workflow, but I don't think we need to dig into that now, but if that's something you guys are interested in, happy to talk later.
So the other thing kind of you should probably invest in is something called a developer sandbox. This is the environment that developers are going to be creating these components in and iterating over them over time. One of the really popular tools for doing this is Storybook, but there were certain scenarios in which we had to sort of invest in our own tool and build something custom, just because the business requirements called for it. So this is one example where we had to deal with a lot of different variations for components, and in order to automate that, we built a pin wrapper around other developer sandboxes, which allowed us to sort of spit out all of these variations automatically instead of having to maintain them by hand constantly. This developer sandbox seems like, okay, sure, why would you need something to build this in, but why can't I just build components in the application itself? Well, it's really important to detach your design system from the application. You want to focus on these components by themselves, because if you start building them out in a particular context, you'll start sort of influencing the way that you're building them. You might choose an API that is specific to that context, but really you're building something that's meant to be used in a lot more situations, and you want to avoid that, and that's why you want to have a little bit of a separation. Think of this as more of an external API, which is then consumed by the application. And these sandboxes are really awesome tools for being able to focus on one component at a time. And if you use something like Storybook, it also allows you to add a lot of visual testing on top of it. So you can do sort of visual regression testing per component level, or you can compose them into higher level features and run testing at that point itself. And then so the last piece is documentation. So you're building something that's, the users aren't really the end users of the product that you're building, but instead it's other designers and developers that you are working with. It might be marketing, it might be product managers, depending on your organization. And the first place that they're going to be introduced to the design system is through this documentation site. And that's how they're going to learn about it and learn to use it over time. So you really should be investing a lot of time and effort into building and maintaining that documentation site. This is sort of the source of truth for anyone that's going to deal with the design system. This will house information around how to use the design system in code, how to get access to the design kit if you're a designer, any changes that were made over time, any considerations that were made in creating a component. So often we document things like accessibility considerations or visual language considerations or even technical challenges that were considered when creating a particular component.
Yeah, providing the rationale behind the components to help others using the components to like kind of get up to speed and kind of understand how it should be used is really, really important. Another thing is definitely looking at thinking about your users. I think often when the documentation site's being kicked off, there's a lack of clarity of who the documentation's for. People think about contributors to the design system versus consumers of the design system, and those are two very different mindsets. When I want to add something to the design system, the things I need to know are very different than if I'm trying to use an existing component. So trying to get clarity of exactly how your design system is going to be used and what your audience is for this documentation site can really save a lot of time when you're creating the content for this site.
And just add, so one piece in the documentation site that we found to be really powerful was having a live playground environment. So embedding a code pen, code sandbox, or if you're working with React, there's tools like React Live that allow you to embed a playground. And we find that it's really powerful because developers can just go in and prototype right there in the browser without having to spin up a new project, install the design system, and then prototype. They can get to a feature set much more quickly than if they had to do everything from scratch.
Yeah, having things like the live playground and things that have been added systematically in code is definitely the most maintainable way to create a documentation set as well. One of the things that we've often run into when creating the documentation site is thinking about maintainability and making sure that everything we do doesn't become out of date 2 months down the road, because you instantly lose trust when that's the case. So just being really being critical about what information should be kind of, for lack of a better word, hard-coded into the documentation site, like what actually needs to be written down versus what's implicit, and making sure that things are only written down once. Don't put it in 2 places, make sure it's linking up to the other place, because the opportunities for inconsistency becomes really, really large. So just thinking about things like that and thinking about the long-term implications of how you build the documentation site will set you up for success in the long run. So then we kind of get into the last piece, so kind of thinking about maintainability and kind of moving that forward. What you're building isn't just a project, it's not going to end up kind of then being shelved after that. Like, this is a living and breathing product that's going to grow with your organization. So because of that, thinking about adoption and thinking about governance is really important. And the sooner you think about these things, the better, because it will impact how you actually design all of the other parts that we just talked about. So adoption, thinking about how you're actually going to roll that out to different teams, how you're going to onboard them, what are the permissions of each team, thinking through that. And then governance, over time, how are you going to enhance the system? How are you going to get feedback on the system? And what's even your version control strategy? All of that, from both the design and development perspective, are things that might start affecting your structure. And that kind of brings us to maintaining the system. So kind of like now that we have those 6 parts and you can kind of take the first stab at each of them, then it's thinking long-term of exactly how that maintenance is going to happen. So the first word of advice is to start small and test. It's really no different than any other product where at first there's probably a lot of assumptions that you're making, and it's better to validate those sooner rather than many months down the road. So typically, this doesn't mean that you don't want to think about all those different constraints that we talked about. You do want to make sure what you're designing from day one is extremely scalable and handling all the different teams and use cases that you need. But at the same time, maybe it means onboarding one team to start. We've had a lot of success while building out the components, kind of giving one team, a consuming team, kind of access to the components as we're building them.
All the problems all at once. Pick one small subset, start there, start getting that feedback, and then iterate from there and expand out across the entire organization.
And kind of with that, as you're thinking about all these different teams, all these different languages, regions, whatever kind of that scaling solution is, thinking about what that contribution and maintenance model is going to be. And there are many different ways to do that, and really the one that's right for your organization will be dependent on many things. How many resources you can allocate full-time to the design system, kind of the scale of your design system, all of those will come into effect. So we've seen teams do kind of that traditional centralized model where there's really one core design system team and they're responsible for updating and maintaining the design system. And if there's any feedback that's required, it goes through that team, it gets prioritized, it goes into a backlog. That definitely works if you have a big enough team to support that model. But always keeping in mind that if it's really holding down timelines of these other teams, like people will always find ways to work around processes. So just being honest with yourself of kind of how much you would be able to support in that model. And then on the other end of the spectrum, having a federated model where maybe things won't be as structured and you may compromise some of the consistency along the way, but it's really enabling everyone, enabling multiple teams to start contributing to that model.
It's important to remember that it's never done. There's a common misconception that we find where people think that we'll create a design system, it's a little project, it'll take 6 months, it'll solve all our problems, and we can go back to doing other stuff. And in reality, that just never works. A design system isn't something that you build once and it just stays that way forever. Instead, you really should be adopting more of a product mindset. Treat the design system as a product itself. Again, remember, your users aren't really the end users of your application or whatever product that you're building, but instead there are designers, product teams, cross-functional product teams, marketing, all the people who are consuming that design system. So treat it like a product. Look at the considerations that you have to make, go talk to your users, understand what their problems are, and then build something that tries to solve those problems. You also kind of need to think about how you're going to be iterating and evolving this design system over time. When do you add a new component to this design system? When do you deprecate something? What does that process look like? Do you use semantic versioning on the code side? What is a breaking change? Is sort of a major visual change a breaking change, or is it only API changes that you consider to be breaking changes? These are really important questions to ask. There's not a single right answer to it. It really depends on your context. It could be that visual changes are really important to your organization, and that needs to be a breaking change, or it could be that we're okay with some amount of visual inconsistency as long as the API remains the same and our product doesn't break. So those are some really important considerations to make.
Yeah, and it's tricky, especially when we talk about that shared common language again. On the design side, almost everything would be almost considered a breaking change in terms of even if you change the pattern of one of your components by a few pixels, all of a sudden if that's being imported into different files, the whole layout gets wonky accordingly. So again, having those semantic versioning conversations and figuring out kind of what's considered breaking and how are you going to have that shared common language is a really tricky one. Particularly given that admittedly design tools really aren't up to speed. If you need legacy version support or this idea of semantic versioning, they're not quite there yet.
And as you sort of embark on the journey of building your own design system or maintaining it over time, you sort of have to first think about how do I secure funding? How do I get my company to invest in building a design system? And then once you have that, are you building that something that's actually providing value to its consumers? And in order to do that, you kind of need to think about what problems is this design system solving for your organization. So at a high level, we sort of have three broad categories: scalability, efficiency, and consistency. On the scalability side, it's things like does it allow you to adopt more of a modular architecture so that teams can work in parallel without duplicating a lot of work? Can you run more data-driven experiments because you have all the sort of foundational blocks to create a new iteration of the UI? And as you scale and grow your product teams, can you actually manage that? Can you scale it so that more teams could be working in parallel without sort of becoming bottlenecks for each other? And also thinking about sort of the workflow side of things, can you divide that work across multiple teams? Do you have a single source of truth so that your brand identity is consistent across all of those experiences that the user goes through? And that can be really important for your organization, or it could be more on the side of we just want something that allows our product teams to scale and grow and still remain efficient. So these are sort of the high-level categories that we have. Some of these might apply to you, maybe none of these apply to you, and you might have other reasons for building a design system. But it's really important to understand what is the core reason that that's driving you to create a design system and adopt a design system. Because in a lot of ways, building the design system is sort of the easier part. The change management that comes along with having to adopt a design system is the harder part. It changes the way teams are going to be working. You're going to have to not only make an argument to get funding to create this design system, but you're also going to be telling other people how to work. You're going to tell them that the way that they've been working is not a good way anymore, and they have to adopt a completely different way, and that's a hard conversation. And if you can back that up with facts and you can back that up with numbers, that becomes a slightly easier conversation. So in order to do that, you need to think about a measurement framework. So again, applying that product mindset. Generally, we recommend having a product manager manage the design system itself and create a framework that allows you to sort of measure the performance of that design system itself. And again, like I said, the design system doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on the revenue of your product. It doesn't automatically make your product more popular or get more users to come to it. It's hard to make that connection one-to-one. So you have to sort of layer it up to the larger vision, where there are going to be things that the team that's building the design system does they can then measure the design system itself, which will have a cascading impact on the product teams, which will then have a cascading impact on the larger organization. So I can give you a small example of that. If your goal is to have a more efficient workflow, by having a design system, you allow your teams to work in parallel, reduce the amount of work that multiple teams have to do, which means that there is less money being spent on building out features, which ultimately means that it frees up more resources for your organization to invest into do things that they were unable to do otherwise. Or if brand is important for you, then by having a design system, you make sure that every single touch point for the user is consistent. They're having a really consistent user experience, which means that it has a very positive impact on your brand value. So if you can find those cascading links to larger goals that your organization has, it makes it not only easy to secure that initial funding, but it also becomes sort of a guide for you to evaluate whether the design system is still being effective or not, and if you're building the right thing or not. So that helps you understand, when do I add a component? If it's about being more efficient, then maybe when 3 teams start to use a component, that's when we add a component to our design system. If it's about being consistent, then as soon as you create a component, you want to add it to the design system to avoid any kind of variation.
And the last part that we really wanted to point out about kind of maintaining this design system and rolling it out over time is it's often overlooked the fact that, as Varun was mentioning, the structure of your organization and the roles that you're asking people to do change, and that's kind of the nature of a design system. And kind of speaking from the design side, there are kind of 2 different roles that end up existing for designers not when the design system is in play. So there's now the idea of people who contribute to a design system, and arguably these designers are being asked to think way more technically and way more systematically than they may have done traditionally. So finding that support and allowing for that to happen and providing whatever training and support's needed for those people who are being the contributors is really key. Because all of a sudden the design decisions that they're making, if they make a decision in one place, that propagates throughout the entire system. On the flip side, you now have the consumers of the design system. And those consumers are kind of now alleviated. They no longer have to actually think about the nitty-gritty anymore. They don't have to figure out exactly what are all my states of my button, what are all my states of component X, because that's kind of figured out for them. So all of a sudden their role changes from having to kind of think about those details, and they can really focus on the holistic experience and solving. It's no longer what are all the states of this button, it's how can I increase conversion of this particular thing, or what does the user want in this scenario. And that's a really powerful mindset change. Given this, these aren't necessarily 2 separate roles. This doesn't have to be 2 separate people, but realizing those 2 kind of unique mindsets and 2 different kind of day-to-day sets, the 2 different sets of day-to-day activities is something to really be mindful of. And yeah, it really will kind of change your organization and hopefully for the better.
Thank you very much. That's everything we have today. I do want to quickly mention there is a new meetup that's starting up in Toronto on Wednesday that's entirely focused on design systems. It's called Design System Community. And Catharine and I are speaking at the first event where we will focus just on sort of the elements of the design system and go a little more deeper into some of the considerations that you can sort of have to think about as you're creating those different elements. So yeah, if you're interested in design systems, I highly recommend joining up that new meetup.
Borrow one of your mics and we'll take some questions. First question.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. It was very informative. Pretty sure we're going to start with a lot of your ideas. Our company is just starting to get into the idea and mindset of building the design system. My question for you is, do you have a tool or something that can help us build the documentation? Like, what's your experience in the tools that you guys use for building the documentation system?
So one recommendation would be Storybook. If you're just starting out, Storybook is a really good developer sandbox, but with the recent update, they added the functionality to be able to document components within Storybook itself. So it's a really good way to get started. But as you grow and sort of scale, some of the options that we've considered is using tools like Next.js or creating a static Angular website or a static React website, and then pairing it with a CMS like Net.cms or Contentful, so that content authors can go ahead and edit that content without having to go through a developer in every single scenario.
Yeah, I don't have a tool recommendation. I think that what Varun mentioned makes sense. I think just keeping in mind who's going to be authoring it. We've had scenarios where it was something that was like fully developed, but then the people who were maintaining the content weren't necessarily people who were tech savvy. So every time there needed to be a content change, there was a huge pipeline of work that happened. So just thinking about who's going to be keeping it up to date and make sure it matches their needs is really important.
Hi. Sorry, so I'm curious how the whole kind of process changes depending on like how many resources you have available to your team. So like one person versus three people versus like 10. Like how would you kind of change the approach generally? Sure.
So there's sort of two parts to it. One is changing the approach to how you build a design system, and the other is how the process changes for building the product itself.
Yeah, I mean, so our team is pretty small, so we kind of have very few kind of design-focused resources. So in that sort of environment, I'm not sure how to kind of streamline a lot of this process to make it useful for us. So we use Storybook, and we skip some things like we don't really use Figma. We go straight to Storybook, and then from that straight to like kind of components. But I'm kind of curious your views on a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's where I was saying that there are sort of those 6 elements, but you might not need all of them depending on your context. So if it's this really small team that's both maintaining the design system and is working on the application side, you probably don't need that design kit because no one's really going to be using that. So you can go from Storybook to code directly, or just have code be the source of truth. And then there's just sort of a Figma file that sort of acts as the starting point that the developers build off of. So that's a really great place to get started. I find that a lot of organizations are in that stage where they're not quite large enough where they have multiple product teams. So even if they do have that, they don't quite have enough resources to dedicate towards that. So having the design system start off as more of a grassroots initiative, and then as you scale, I would highly recommend finding ways to measure the impact that design system is having, because you'll get to a point where the situation changes, suddenly it's really hard to dedicate resources towards that design system, and that's where you want to make an argument towards having full-time dedicated resources towards that design system. And whether or not we need that full-time dedication, again, depends on if there's a lot of iteration happening, if the product is really stable, if the brand is really stable and not a lot of changes need to happen, then you can definitely switch to more of a federated model where the product teams themselves maintain the design system. But if there's a lot of iterations happening and the design system is starting to become a bottleneck for feature teams to be able to create new features, that's where you need to have more of a centralized team that is fully dedicated to that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
So my question is, how do you not put business logic into the data system? Like, what is the which component that you would not put business logic in?
Yeah, so from the code side, really treat your design system as a dependency. So think of it as a UI library that you install from NPM that really does not know anything about your application. That would be ideal, and that it's good to have that sort of division between what goes in the design system and what goes in the application side. But again, you're building something that's specific to your context, so it will have the design language of your product. It will have some information that's biased by your project or by the product that you're building. But I would avoid putting things like, if you, for example, if it's an e-commerce site, the cart logic inside the design system itself. Even going to that e-commerce example, one of the things we realized was a product tile ends up having a lot of complexity embedded within it. Whether a product is on sale or in one region you might be able to alter that product, in another region you might not. So even something like a product tile, we found that it was really hard to maintain that within the design system itself because there was so much logic associated with that. So in that scenario, we adopted something called recipes, where we would showcase to people how to construct a product tile and have that recipe in the documentation itself, but not maintain a product tile component in the design system itself.
Yeah, I think the product card example was like the one for me that really kind of changed my thinking of the business logic. There have been other design systems that I've been a part of where the business logic was something that they did really want to scale. They wanted all regions and all brands to have the same business logic. So then we did create components that had business logic in them, but there was a fine line between them. There was the idea of CMS components and then UI components, and there was kind of that interface layer in between. And that business logic was in the CMS layer, and those are still reusable components, but in a very different sense than what a traditional design system would be. And so whether that's a need or not, that's one way to handle that. If you do want to have scalable business logic, but in this other product card scenario, the business logic was very different and something updating all the time, so it definitely didn't make sense.
I have a quick question about, because I draw the connection from design system with the existing Google's material design, which is full blown. Would you recommend companies with a smaller team, with lack of resources pretty much, adapt a full blown design system such as material design and eventually build that into their infrastructure and then have the development team to grow in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak from the design side. Definitely have seen that with smaller teams where maybe it's like one designer to many developers, and at that point, creating a scalable design system is just not possible. So pulling from something like Google Material definitely makes sense. Of course, the cases that they've made it for may not necessarily match your cases, even something like a date taker, like the order of the year versus where that should be. That's a conversation I was having today, and like there's like nuanced things about the components that may not work, but then you can kind of start tackling those one by one as you're prioritizing down the road.
So material comes up a lot. Google made material for themselves, but also for other companies that are building apps for Android. So it's trying to solve a lot of different problems. If you're working on a product that has a really strong brand identity, then you probably don't want to mix that with what's coming from material. So in that case, there's probably an argument to invest in creating your own design system. That doesn't mean you have to start from scratch. There's a lot of fantastic UI libraries that allow you to sort of act as a foundation layer that you can build on top of. Material is very opinionated as far as what the visual language is, and if your brand does not have a very strong identity, I find that material eats it very quickly. And then you get to a point where you will have a stakeholder that will talk about, we should not have these shadows, or we should not have this ripples, and suddenly you spend a lot of time fighting material and trying to pull that piece out of material. So definitely you can adopt it. We've done that a lot in the past, but it really comes down to whether you're working on a product that has that strong visual identity or not.
Hi. So in the organizations that I've worked in, most of the marketing and communications teams are completely separate from all the development. I come from a development background, so I'm only thinking of the component library, whereas what marketing produces from a presentation point of view and that sort of thing seems very separate. And I haven't used Storybook or any of these tools before. How do they get looped into the process?
So we've dealt with that a little bit at Varun itself. We have a design system that's used entirely by the marketing team who are not technical, and we still created it using React and Storybook and all those tools, but the end product is components that are exposed within our CMS. So in our case, we're using Contentful as the CMS, so that's the piece that marketing interacts with. So they don't really care about how I use this React component in code. They have those components exposed through the CMS, and they can just go and compose pages using that. That's sort of one scenario that I've seen it quite a lot. Another really good example is GitHub. For their prior design system, they have sort of two variants of it. They have the core design system that's used to build GitHub, the product, and then they have a subset that is targeted just for marketing that's used by the marketing product teams. In that scenario, they do have dedicated developers and designers working with marketing that can use that sort of subset of the design system. Apart from that, I think there's similar design system ideas that are used for presentations. So I don't think something like Google Slides works there, but I've definitely seen teams use Figma as a tool for creating presentations. And then that's sort of one of the demos that Figma does, is they create a presentation using a design system that's built for Figma. These are some of the things that I've seen.
You mentioned UI libraries that are alternatives to materials. Are there ones that you recommend in particular?
Is there a particular JavaScript framework you work with?
Just a general question.
It really depends on the framework. So in the React ecosystem, there's quite a few, like a lot of people use soft components and build on top of that. There's Reach UI, which is more accessibility focused. React Kit, REAKIT, which is quite good, also accessibility focused, but a little bit more feature rich. Foundation is another example. Honestly, there's quite a lot. And they all come with trade-offs. Some are more opinionated, some have stronger visual language. Others are less opinionated and don't really give you a lot of default design choices. And you have to sort of invest more and build more on top of that.
I think you have like a magic bullet or something.
No, unfortunately, there isn't. No.
In your experiences, how have you measured the success of a design system? For example, you talked about efficiency, so how would you measure that to share it out?
So that really, again, depends on the context within which you're working. So for efficiency, one simple way to do that is, well, actually not a simple way because it's really hard to measure that. So cycle time. So you can sort of track the cycle time of a product team over a long period of time before the team had a design system and after they had a design system. There isn't necessarily an automated way to do that. If you're working in a more agile fashion, that might be tracked on the team itself already. So it's just a matter of sort of tracking it over time. Some of this is also not very qualitative data. It might be more feeling, where you just go to talk to product managers and find that, yeah, we were really slow last year, but now we're a little bit faster since we have a design system. That's sort of the hardest one to measure, to be honest.
Yeah, I know the qualitative part is it's hard to measure, but it's something that you can like definitely see. Like at least from my experiences, when you first release a design system, sometimes like the teams using it, there's this little like blip for a minute where it's like, wait, you're asking us to change our ways, or like, wait, how do I use this thing? And figuring out exactly how to use the design system is kind of that moment of, I don't really know what I'm getting into, but then you can kind of see how afterwards it really increases, and the creative things that can be done with the design system and kind of the quality of the work that comes out of it is, you start to see that kind of increase over time, and so you can even start measuring the actual usability of the pages that you're creating, and you can start mapping that back as well.
I just remember one other thing, not something I've done in practice, but I found out about this from another talk, where a team started measuring, doing regular surveys to get an idea of how much time designers and developers are spending doing actual design and development work, as opposed to in meetings or sort of understanding the documentation and all that kind of stuff, and seeing how that number increased over time once they started adopting a design system.
Okay, one last question. So you briefly mentioned Brad Frost and atomic design system, and I guess where does the design system start, and is it like, does it cover atoms, molecules, organisms, pages, templates, or is it part of that? What are your thoughts on that?
Let's go for a beer, and we can talk about this for 5 hours and still come to no conclusion.
Yeah, I've heard so many different answers. Interested in your perspective.
Yeah, again, it's the cop-out answer, but it really does depend. Every design system that I've been a part of has been different, and I think more than anything, it's coming up to that shared common understanding. Often, I mean, if we're talking in atomic language, which again, like we'll grab a beer and talk about that, then it's kind of like often you see it kind of stop at that molecule level, where really that's where you can argue that there's no business logic at that point. But then there's other scenarios where, yeah, you want templates and you really want to start pushing it out against everything and you want absolute consistency and absolute business logic, then that's when you start kind of encapsulating everything.
That's it for tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing with us about design systems. We still have probably about another half an hour, actually more than an hour. So feel free to chat with our speakers, feel free to grab some more drinks. Hope you had all a good time, and we'll see you again next month with a different topic. And thank you. If anybody's interested in speaking at WTO, please come to me or email us at talks@WTO.ca. We're always looking for speakers for events like this. Thank you.